Hello, everybody, again. My name is Jose Sanchez, and I'm assistant professor at the University of Southern California. On behalf of the Acadia Board of Directors, I'm here to present the 2017 Acadia Digital Practice Design Award. This award recognizes creative work that advances the discipline of architecture through the development of digital media. Past recipients of this award include firms like Real San Fratello, Karen Timberlake, Jenny Sabin, Cecil Ballman, Philip Beasley, Grammaticolor, and many others. I'm very, very happy to present today this award to Iwamoto Scott, who are here with us today. Iwamoto Scott is a practice that is led by Lisa Iwamoto. It's an associate professor from the University of California, Berkeley, and Craig Scott, who is a professor of California College of Arts. Their firm is situated in San Francisco, and it has an international outreach. It really operates across multiple scales, and it reaches from full-scale fabrications, museums and installations, theoretical proposals, competitions, and commission buildings. Some of their critical projects, among the extensive amount of work that they've developed over the last decade, include the Pinterest headquarters that has recently been completed, the Jellyfish House, commissioned by the Vitre Design Museum, the Besser Cloud installation in the Sire Gallery, and again, many more. Their work has been shown in over 50 exhibitions around the globe, including institutions like MoMA, the Guggenheim Museum, the SF MoMA, and the Vitre Design Museum. The Acadia Award really represents one more award in a really kind of extensive list of awards that Lisa and Craig have accumulated over the past decade, and again, those include over 20 AIA awards, most recently the AIA Honors Awards for the Pinterest headquarters, and also the Emerging Voices and Young Architects Award from the Architectural League in New York. More personally, I would like to argue that software often creates a path of least resistance, a form of default conditions, and I think that is firms like Iwamoto Scott that really are creating vantage points, and that is something that this community should be very grateful and should appreciate. The board of directors is recognizing the ambitious agenda that Iwamoto Scott has been put forward and has continuously developed over the past decade and further. So I really want to ask you to help me present the 2017 Acadia Digital Practice and Excellence Award to Iwamoto Scott.
Thanks so much. We're really honored to receive this award. We're also really happy that it has the word practice in the title, because we have been concentrating these last number of years on building the bricks and mortar side of our practice. We really began with design research at two very different scales on the outer sides of the discipline, having to do with installations, which gave us an opportunity to explore analog methods of making with digital fabrication as a way to affect material behavior with geometry. And at the other end of the spectrum, the speculative projects, which gave us a chance to experiment with spatial and formal ideas, which we didn't have a chance to at that time, realize in built work, as well as larger scale urban proposals. And so those two forms of research are now making their way into our buildings and interiors projects. We'd like to talk about 5 of those projects. We've reorganized them a little bit for some conceptual alignments, and then if we have time, talk about a speculative proposal. So in terms of our installation work, there are really 2 lines of related research. One having to do with how to make thin materials volumetric, as well as have a perceptual depth. And here we're interested in using really commonplace materials, things like mylar, 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, and netting, as a way of defamiliarizing the familiar. So 8.5 by 11 paper becomes voluminous. Something as simple as insect netting it can appear rigid. And the second line of research is thinking about structure and rigidity through folding. And that works at both the level of how the part-to-whole relationships work in terms of aggregation, and also down to the level of detail. Within all that, where our kind of conceptual goals around that have to do with how to think about how the aggregation of these pieces come together as a holistic, more synthetic form, and also how the material can begin to defy some of the, and confound some of the expectations one might have. So, for example, the voussoir cloud, a vaulted compressive structure made out of super lightweight material. That material sometimes, through its geometric deformation, appearing like a solid block, and other times a light translucent material. So with the building projects, this is for the Bloomberg Tech Hub. It's in a way opposite of the voussoir cloud project in that we were looking at lumber and how to think about lumber in a number of different ways. So very much like the fabrication research, which centered around paper and lightweight materials, the construction industry is also full of flat things like plywood and MDF and veneer. Here we were interested in lining the room with lumber. This is actually made out of a single tree, and to transform it at the ceiling plane for this long span. So really trying to reinterpret the beam so that it could become both a surface and become porous. And so in cross-section, it transforms from a rectangle to a triangle and begins to allow for it to be a surface which meets the vertical surfaces of the space, as well as allow for porosity inside and some structural depth to be able to span across the space. This is also a practical application, and so we're trying to combine some of the pragmatic concerns of building together with this line of kind of digital fabrication research, and so this becomes the mechanical louver as well for the space above, and spreads out over the guard desk. And then that same geometry, the geometry of the four-sided element becoming a three-sided element, we explored in a different way also with the aquarium and a data feed display that translates from a parallelogram to a triangle at the top through the cut in the floor plate. It becomes a work bar at the top, and here we're able to see the geometry of the fish tank below and the triangular space above, forming the interconnection between the two floors, and then the live feed data, which is then abstracted to become the visual information on the interior of the space. For the Miami garage, it was a more direct connection, let's say, to the aspects of structural folding. So here, we were interested in making a kind of hybrid structure surface with the skin, in this case through aluminum panels. The project took on three components, which is that of the skin, the stair, and then the small little boutique office space, again, re-employing similar geometries of the chevron and the simple facet, in this case, which translates up through the vertical facade of the office building to create a little bit more of a dynamic aspect, but yet again, using really common materials such as simple storefront and exposed slabs. And then in the case of the garage facade, using the folded aluminum panels to create the porosity needed for the ventilation again, as well as an overall mural that could reflect a little bit of the Miami sky and the idea of the coloration of that city. So there are 5 panel types, each of which has a different porosity, and those porosity is arrayed over the different floors, so that in aggregate, they were able to achieve the percent openness for the space. And in terms of the hybridity of its structure, one of the things that we were quite adamant about was not having panelization such that the vertical, such that the structure was revealed. And so there was an offset grid, which is cantilevered above and below on the slabs, and then the panel itself takes the load from the center of the span of each floor, translating it to those spars that extend off of the slab. And in that way, when looking through it, there's not the exposed structure, but it seems more as a single piece of fabric, for example, or a single brushstroke across the face of the building. And then it changes quite a bit with light. So in thinking about thin surfaces and volume, we try to do that with every scale of project and every kind of surface. It's something that we see many times in the construction industry, the flatness of the skin. This project actually was quite restricted in terms of its dimensions from the edge of the slab to the property line. There was only about 8 inches on one side and 14 inches on the other. But even within that thin depth, and half of that is a structure, which is about 6 inches, even within that depth, we were interested in creating a surface such that it could change through perception and the way that someone would look at it. So sometimes appearing more sculptural, sometimes appearing more flat, sometimes appearing like single lines of planes, and sometimes an array of the panels themselves. With our building projects, we have a different, we like space too. So in our building projects, we tried to connect some of the spatial and formal ideas that we've been struggling with and kind of grappling with over the years with our material strategies. So the fog house, which is represented on the image on your left, is the very first project we had done together as an office. And really what it is the strategizing of negative space making through intersection. And so the double negative, which serves as an inspiration, is the idea of two voids which intersect to create a third condition through that quality of intersection that could not be predicted, let's say. It would be an unpredictable result given the nature of the two original volumes that were intersected to create it. And so we tried to think about how to bring that attitude and that sense of space making into each of our projects. We've done that in limited ways with elements of different schemes, and the scheme that I'd like to talk about is that for Pinterest, which was recently completed early last year for the Pinterest headquarters there. So this is an adaptive reuse of a John Deere factory. It's a purely interiors project, and the building had been at one time renovated, like sometime in the 1980s. And that renovation included a light well, which traveled down up to the second floor. It's a building incredibly limited by light. It only has light on the two far edges, and so there's 200 feet of sides, which don't have any natural daylight. And so this became a really important element to this space. And what we chose to do is to extend that surface through, the atrium through to the first floor, and insert a stair which would become kind of heart of the building and the method of vertical communication throughout. And then that finds its way into the public space of the lower level. The lower level is exclusively a social space, which is something that we often find in tech offices as well. And so it kind of wraps together with the circulation sequence of the whole building from the entry through. So a few images of the entry and wrapping into the all-hands space. And then you're able to start seeing the stair in the far distance. And the stair itself is structured from 3 points, from the lower landing, from the upper landing, and then it's hanging off the back of the space. It's constructed of 2 layers of perforated material, which each have a slightly different hole size, so that the overall moire is much more like a fabric. It's much more like looking through a veil than it is like looking at a geometric collection of things. And then there are a series of apertures which travel throughout to allow for visual communication also among the floors. One of the aspects of this stair is that it does create a double negative, but that also connects to a principle of Pinterest and their brand identity. They use the term knitting, which is another way of talking about collaboration, but it talks about collaboration and for us in a very formal way, which is the idea of 2 things coming together and creating this void in between, which is how the different pieces become knit together. So that is how we began to think of the stair as these 2 needles that could overlap and create this small void between. So inside that is a small prism that is the overlap of those 2 spaces, which allows for communication, visual communication, not just from outside of the stair, but also within itself, and seeing it through here, through those layers of material, down to below. And in really every instance, re-encountering it in multiple forms, both as a negative and as a positive from looking up above. And so the stair emerges as this kind of portal at the second floor and rises up to define the heart of that social space as well.
So this project, though it started before the garage and finished after it, and though we didn't set out consciously to relate them, has a kind of interesting corollary with that Miami garage in terms of the underlying geometry of the module is essentially with the same premise, which is that a 6-sided figure in that case is translated to a 4-sided void within. And so the nature of that underlying geometry follows this idea that a kind of conceptually simple device can yield a perceptually complex result. And the site is one which is on the eastern side of the mountains of the Napa Valley, facing this man-made lake, Berryessa, with these incredible views in all directions. Yet we didn't want it to be the kind of cliche of the all-glass house looking outward equally in all directions, but in fact confounded that with a kind of equal attraction towards the inward space of this central void. And at the same time, there's a kind of programmatic setup whereby the client wanted these 4 different spaces, but not to have them too separate from each other, but to have them somewhat separate. That geometry was adapted to accommodate these 4 simple boxes. Sorry, let me go back if this will. That then gets connected by these trapezoidal interstitial deck spaces between them. So the plan looks like it would be easy to build, but in section, it becomes a more complex thing, and that's because all the boxes are scaling differently to accommodate their different programs and to kind of address the surroundings differently. This condition of unstable soils led us to a thickened mat slab as a solution that's pretty different than the typical California, pier-based foundations to deal with seismic, which usually include a lot of piers into the ground. In this case, the slab being that thick allowed us to taper it up around the entire perimeter and get this sense of floating on the terrain, which we were really after. The site's quite rugged, and the house, there was a desire to have this sense of it kind of having arrived on site from somewhere else, but at the same time be very much adapted to and rooted in that place. So this is, as you come in and perceive that void as an object upon entry, and it bifurcates your path and view with the circulation that wraps around it. And then the different inflections of this 3-sided glass void produce this interesting effect of the refracted and refracted light and reflected views that happen throughout the day around this central spatial condition. And then at the same time, you're moving between the program blocks as sleeping and living and guest and yoga rooms that are served by this walkway, and you're constantly being pulled out towards the landscape and kind of folded back in around this void. So these are 2 of those 4 trapezoidal spaces in between the 4 boxes of the plan that open out to very different landscapes in each case. Again, to move beyond that kind of glass box paradigm, which the client had in fact thought he might want, but luckily for everyone involved agreed he wanted something more complex than. There was an interesting instance of a kind of invisible deployment of computation here, where we had a wide array of unusually or irregularly sized pieces of cedar lumber that we were lining all these trapezoidal voids of the covered decks with, and we, it's kind of a micro scale use of scripting that no one really knows about or sees, but in a way to organize the joints where we wanted them, given their uneven lengths of wood, and also to reduce the waste of the offcut. This is a view from that main living space, both outward to the lake and inward to the inner void. And then as you turn around and the space opens up in different ways. And the lighting was another kind of micro instance of bigger ideas, working at a small scale. In this case, they become these negative spaces within the ceiling. And it opens up in a dramatic way at this one corner of the main living, dining, kitchen box towards the lakeside. So on a much different scale, this does revisit ideas, some of the things Lisa talked about with the installation projects, and interest in a thickening and deepening of a essentially very thin surface. In this case, the kind of nearly ubiquitous unitized curtain wall that almost every development project these days seems to demand, and also a very onerous and demanding process from the San Francisco planning department and the planning code requirements. So the other complexities built into the project have to do with a pre-existing private tennis club with 12 courts within it and 12 courts on the roof. And there's a negotiation whereby the developer agreed to kind of fold half of those courts into the project and underneath it. So there's a pressure from the external pressures of the planning code, and then the internal pressures of structuring this 1 million square foot mixed-use development on top of 24 tennis courts, and including a community rec center and below market rate housing and so on, and mid-block passageways and things that were all part of the bigger package. So here we're looking at a diagram where on your left is what the planning code's asking for through, this, both the device of a skyplane bulk reduction system that they adopted from Philadelphia's planning code, which is a kind of evolution of the New York zoning and planning ideas, and which essentially produces a wedding cake form if you let it, and it's hard to get around that. But they, in addition, are asking for a kind of a quite solid base and a more transparent top. And so we were resisting that simple response, a kind of oversimplification of such a complex and large-scale project, and therefore adopted this idea of the kind of modulated, thickened surface, and these are some diagrams of how it maps around one side of the project and makes its way around according to how this project sits in the city and according to issues of heat gain and so on. So these thickened surfaces have a gradient to them in terms of their directionality and opacity and transparency percentages. And the other aspect of the project was that there is likely to be a phasing of it into two, and rather than simply give what is asked for in terms of that almost every American planning department these days wants, which is break down the massing and mix up the materials. Those are, these kind of comments you hear from almost every planning department in this country. What we thought of it as an opportunity to do that in a different way than we typically see in our city, and that the phasing, the logistics of that allowed us to think of these as quite different buildings and kind of odd siblings in a way. And this gets at, through diagrams, some of the way the unitized curtain wall in this relative thinness can achieve a kind of perceptual thickness or perceptual complexity in terms of how it changes substantially as one engages it in different viewpoints in the city. That building we refer to as the tower, and this one the Vale. They're both using various cementitious products of terracotta and other panelized products that are kind of off the shelf, but trying to use them in a bit of a defamiliarized ways. So another project that is in the same neighborhood. This, by the way, situates our office, which is at the bottom of that slide, in the context of this area of San Francisco. Also CCA, where I teach, you can see outlined there. And some of the developments, even though the city's quite built out, there's some, rapidly changing pieces of the city still. And so the Warriors Arena, the Uber headquarters, is down the street. And we're dealing with the site here, which is the last buildable parcel in Mission Bay, and the blue piece. And it has a quite, like the Godot house I showed earlier, a kind of potential as a building in the round to engage this incredible, view in multiple directions, but also through the device of inflections and thickening and deepening of surfaces, a way to try to engage the viewer at these different speeds. It happens to be up against the freeway, and the city is expecting a building that acts as a kind of gateway to this view on top of the typical ask of the broken up massing and the mixing of materials. And lastly, just a few more images of that. And this is a brand new project, so it's just kind of in the early stages. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on the speculative projects that Lisa mentioned in the setup, which we've done over the years, and they've often been with a brief of having to kind of think forward and look towards the future. That's what was asked in almost every one of these ones you see here, the Jellyfish House, the City of the Future competition, the Edgar Skeet Towers, and the Talon Architecture Biennale. And so they're dealing with a kind of urban scale that we were lucky enough to kind of move forward into a semi-real project with an unnamed large tech company that we worked on for a couple years. And the ask was basically to try to reach some version of this kind of combination of a managed and fortuitous indeterminacy that you find in a place like Burning Man. And they wanted to think about the possibility of making their own version of an instant city that would recur as a place to kind of dream big and so on, and have this kind of built into the moonshot culture of the place. So it's about a kind of binary translation, a very simple idea of a kind of, the logo becomes a kind of giant scale code that can then feed into the housing of up to 100,000 people on a temporary basis in all these different modes of temporary housing. And it also could have a kind of pure state on more tabula rasa-like sites and a more adapted state on more complex sites. And so these are a few images of how that project played out and evolved into a much different kind of project over the course of time. And this is some of the stuff before NDAs were involved in, the rest of which we can't show. And then I want to just end on a project that we're just diving into, which is where we're taking a city block of San Francisco and combining ideas of Los Angeles' small lot development notion, where single family houses start to approach the density of multifamily densities, and also from the developers interested also in incorporating ideas of the elemental housing projects you see happening in Chile and other places, so that it builds on the notion of a kind of managed yet fortuitous indeterminacy built into, in this case, a kind of urban condition and a block of the typical San Francisco otherwise single family fabric which surrounds this block. And with that, I'm a little over time, so thank you.
Thank
And
you.
Thank you to Acadia for this really amazing award. It's a great honor. Thanks.